We often think of medieval peasant bread as the worst possible food. Dark, coarse loaves made from whatever scraps the poor could scrape together, barely edible, and certainly nothing you choose to eat today. But what if I told you that the bread medieval peasants were forced to eat was actually healthier than the expensive artisan loaves we pay premium prices for now? These weren't just survival foods. They were nutritionally dense, gut-healing, blood sugar stabilizing breads that modern nutritional science is only now beginning to understand. Without access to refined white flour, medieval peasants ate bread that kept them healthier than our modern diet does. In this video, you'll discover 10 types of poor man's bread that were considered inferior in medieval times, but are nutritionally superior to anything in your local bakery today. And at the end, an uncomfortable truth about why we abandoned bread that was actually good for us. Number 1. Horsebread, the multigrain powerhouse that delivers complete protein without meat. Walk into a medieval stable or manor and you'd find a dense, heavy loaf that wasn't just for horses. That's a myth perpetuated by the wealthy who wanted to distance themselves from what the working class ate. Horsebread was made from a combination of grains and legumes, typically peas, fava beans, and whatever whole grain flour was available, usually wheat or barley with high bran content. Historical records from the 16th and 17th centuries describe horsebread recipes that combined these ingredients into loaves that were nutritionally superior to pure grain bread in a way modern nutritionists are only now understanding. The genius of horsebread is protein complementation. Grains are deficient in the amino acid lysine, but contain adequate amounts of methionine and cysteine. Legumes like peas and beans are rich in lysine but low in methionine. When you combine them in one loaf, you create a complete protein profile that rivals meat. Medieval labourers eating horsebread were getting all 9 essential amino acids without touching animal products. The typical ratio was roughly equal parts legumes to grain, creating bread that was approximately 20 to 25% protein by weight, far higher than pure wheat bread. This wasn't accidental. Generations of observation taught bakers that workers who ate horsebread maintained strength and endurance through brutal physical labour better than those eating pure grain bread. The texture was dense and chewy, the opposite of the soft, fluffy bread we expect today. But that density meant slower digestion, steadier blood sugar, and sustained energy through long working days. For folks concerned about protein intake and blood sugar control, horsebread is exactly what we should be eating. But today, we pay premium prices for isolated protein powders and supplements. Medieval peasants got complete protein by mixing cheap ingredients that grew in the same fields. Number 2. Maslin bread, the mixed grain loaf that balances blood sugar better than any single grain can. In medieval Europe, pure wheat bread was for the wealthy. The poor ate maslin, a mixture of whatever grains were available, typically wheat and rye in varying ratios, sometimes with barley or oats mixed in. For us, it's a simple recipe. For them, it was an economic necessity. The harvest determined the mixture, and peasants baked with what they had. But this forced mixture created something that modern nutritional science now recognizes as superior to pure wheat bread in almost every measurable way. Rye has a fundamentally different carbohydrate structure than wheat. It contains more soluble fiber, specifically arabinoxylans, which form a gel in your digestive system. This gel slows down the absorption of glucose into your bloodstream, which means maslin bread produces a much flatter blood sugar response than pure wheat bread. Research consistently shows that rye-based foods have a lower glycemic index compared to wheat bread, with values typically ranging from 41 to 57 on the glycemic index scale. Studies have demonstrated that rye bread induces lower insulin response in the hours following a meal, and intervention studies show that rye-based foods versus wheat control foods have a positive effect on both insulin and glucose responses. Medieval peasants didn't know about glycemic index. They just knew that Maslin bread stuck to your ribs and kept you working through long days of manual labour. The reason is biochemical. The combination of wheat gluten structure and rye fibre creates a bread that digests slowly, releases energy steadily, and doesn't trigger the insulin spike and crash that modern bread causes. Today we're told to eat whole wheat for health, but whole wheat alone still spikes blood sugar. Medieval peasants, by necessity, ate a grain mixture that modern diabetics would benefit from enormously, but that modern bakers have completely abandoned because pure wheat is easier to work with and produces more consistent results. Number 3. Barley bread, the forgotten grain that feeds your gut bacteria better than any probiotic. Go down another step in medieval food hierarchy and you find barley bread. This was poverty food. Barley was animal feed and the grain of last resort for humans. Wheat and rye failed. You ate barley. But barley contains something that wheat has almost none of, and that modern bread has systematically removed. Beta-glucan, a type of soluble fibre that modern research has identified as one of the most effective prebiotic compounds for gut health. Beta-glucan isn't digested in your small intestine. It travels intact to your colon, where your gut bacteria ferment it, producing short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Butyrate is the primary fuel for your colon cells, and it has powerful anti-inflammatory effects throughout your entire body. Low butyrate production is linked to inflammatory bowel disease, metabolic syndrome, and even depression. Research shows that eating just 60 grams of whole grain barley daily for 4 weeks dramatically improves your gut health. Your gut contains trillions of bacteria, and the right balance determines whether you have good digestion or constant problems. Barley specifically increases the diversity of these bacteria, meaning you get more types of beneficial microbes instead of having a few dominant strains. It also improves the ratio between 2 major bacterial groups in your gut, firmicutes and bacteroidetes, which researchers have linked to healthy weight and better metabolism. Most importantly, barley increases specific beneficial bacteria like bifidobacterium, the same bacteria found in expensive probiotic supplements, and roseburia, a bacteria that produces butyrate, the compound that keeps your colon healthy and reduces inflammation throughout your body. Studies consistently show that people who eat barley regularly have higher levels of these beneficial bacteria and higher butyrate production than people who don't. Think of it this way. Every probiotic pill you buy is trying to add beneficial bacteria to your gut. Medieval peasants eating barley bread were feeding the beneficial bacteria already in their gut, which is far more effective and costs nothing. The texture of barley bread is dense and chewy, nothing like the soft, fluffy bread we expect today. That density is exactly why it works. Your body has to work to break it down, which means slower digestion, steadier energy, and more food for beneficial bacteria. Modern bread is designed to be easy to eat and digest quickly. That's the opposite of what your gut needs. Medieval poverty forced people to eat bread that modern science now says is ideal for metabolic and digestive health. Number 4. Pea and bean bread, the protein-packed loaf that modern vegans wish they could find. When grain harvests failed completely, medieval peasants turned to pulse bread made from dried peas, beans, and lentils ground into flour and mixed with whatever grain was available. This was famine food, the lowest of the low, mocked by anyone who could afford better. But pulse bread has a nutritional profile that puts modern protein bread to shame. Pulses are legumes, which means they're high in protein and contain all the essential amino acids when combined with even small amounts of grain. A loaf made from half wheat and half pea flour delivers complete protein in ratios similar to meat, something pure grain bread cannot do. Medieval peasants eating pulse bread during lean times were getting protein nutrition that kept them functional when meat was unavailable. The other advantage is fibre. Pulses contain both soluble and insoluble fibre in quantities that dwarf grain. This fibre not only slows digestion and stabilises blood sugar, but also binds to cholesterol in your digestive tract and removes it from your body. Studies show that regular consumption of pulse-based foods significantly lowers LDL cholesterol and reduces cardiovascular disease risk. Medieval famine food is what modern cardiologists should be recommending. The taste and texture of pulse bread is earthy and dense, with a slight bitterness that medieval people would have masked with whatever fat or flavouring they had. Modern palates find it challenging because we've been trained to expect sweet, soft bread. But the nutritional density is undeniable. Pulse bread delivers more protein than whole wheat bread and significantly more fibre. For people concerned about protein intake and blood sugar control, this is exactly what we should be eating, but it's what medieval people ate only when they had no choice. Number 5. Bark bread. In the depths of medieval famines, particularly in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, peasants turned to the inner bark of trees when grain supplies completely failed. This was desperation food, the mark of absolute poverty. The inner bark, called phloem, is the living tissue between the outer bark and the wood that transports nutrients through the tree. Medieval records and traditional Sami practices describe bark from pine, birch, elm, and other trees being harvested, dried, ground into flour, and mixed with whatever grain was available to stretch scarce supplies. This sounds like eating wood, and the wealthy mocked it mercilessly. But the phloem layer contains something modern nutrition science has recently begun to understand. The inner bark contains concentrated starches, natural sugars, and essential vitamins, including significant amounts of vitamin C. Research shows that phloem has approximately 1,000 to 1,200 calories per kilogram. More importantly, bark flour provides complex carbohydrates that digest slowly and maintain stable blood sugar levels throughout the day, unlike refined flours that trigger rapid glucose spikes and crashes. Historical evidence indicates that bark bread was typically made by mixing 1/4 to 1/3 bark flour with grain flour. Pure bark bread was nearly indigestible and extremely bitter, but mixed properly, it created a loaf that modern studies show provides lasting satiety and reduces the urge to snack between meals. The bitter compounds naturally present in bark also play a role in appetite regulation, as bitter tastes trigger digestive enzymes and hormones that enhance nutrient absorption and signal fullness more effectively than sweet or bland foods. Among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, bark bread from Scots pine served as an important source of vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy during long winters. This wasn't just famine food for them, it was integrated into their regular diet because they understood its preservation and nutritional benefits. For medieval peasants across Europe, bark bread was the difference between starvation and survival during crop failures. The bread that kept people alive through the worst famines in European history contained an ingredient we've completely abandoned. Modern foragers and experimental bakers are rediscovering bark flour, but it remains obscure. Medieval poverty forced the discovery of a food source that provided slow-burning energy and prevented disease. We've forgotten it exists. Number 6. Acorn bread, the wild foraged loaf that delivers compounds modern medicine is rediscovering. In times of severe shortage, medieval peasants gathered acorns, leached out the bitter tannins by soaking them in water, dried them, ground them into flour, and baked them into bread. This was survival food, the mark of true desperation. But acorns contain compounds that modern research has identified as potent metabolic regulators. acorns are rich in tannins, specifically elagotannins, which your gut bacteria convert into urolithins. Research published in Cell Reports Medicine found that urolithin A supplementation improved muscle strength, exercise performance, and biomarkers of mitochondrial health in middle-aged adults. Urolithin A is a polyphenol derived from the metabolism of dietary elagotannins by human gut microbiota. Once absorbed, it can trigger mitophagy and alter host immune function, mitochondrial health, and intestinal barrier integrity. Medieval peasants eating acorn bread during famines were consuming these compounds naturally. Acorns also have a favourable macronutrient profile. They're higher in fat than most grains, primarily monounsaturated fat similar to olive oil, and lower in carbohydrates. This makes acorn bread more satiating and less likely to spike blood sugar than grain-based breads. The challenge with acorns is the preparation. The tannins must be removed through repeated soaking and water changes, a labour-intensive process that medieval peasants had no choice but to perform. Modern foragers are rediscovering this process, and small-scale bakers are experimenting with acorn flour, but it remains obscure. For medieval peasants, this was poverty. For modern metabolic health, this is exactly the kind of nutrient-dense, blood sugar-friendly bread we should be eating, but have completely forgotten exists. Number 7. Bran bread, the fibre bomb that was considered inedible by the wealthy. Medieval milling technology wasn't precise. Stone mills crushed grain, but didn't separate components cleanly. Wealthy people wanted white bread, so millers sifted the flour through progressively finer screens to remove bran and germ. What was left behind, the coarse bran and bits of germ, was sold cheaply to the poor or fed to animals. Poor families bought this coarse dark flour and baked it into dense heavy loaves that were the opposite of the light white bread the rich ate. But this bread that the wealthy rejected is exactly what modern nutritional science says we need. Bran is the outer layer of the grain kernel, and it contains the vast majority of the fibre, B vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients in the grain. When you remove bran to make white flour, you remove almost everything that makes grain nutritious. Medieval bran bread was significantly higher in bran content than modern whole wheat bread. This massive fibre content meant that bran bread moved through the digestive system slowly, feeding gut bacteria extensively and stabilising blood sugar dramatically. Research indicates that high bran bread consumption improves markers of colon health, reduces constipation, and lowers inflammatory markers compared to refined grain bread. Medieval poor people eating bran bread had gut health that the wealthy, eating refined white bread, could not match. The irony is complete. The bread considered unfit for respectable people was the bread that kept digestive systems healthy. The bread the wealthy prized was nutritionally empty and metabolically damaging. We've inherited the wealthy preference and abandoned the poor man's nutrition. Number 8. Sourdough rye, the sour poverty bread that heals leaky gut. Rye was cheaper than wheat throughout medieval Europe, which meant the poor ate more of it. And because rye is difficult to leaven with the wild yeasts available at the time, it was typically made as sourdough with long fermentation times. The result was dense, sour, dark bread that was the staple of peasant diets from Scandinavia to Eastern Europe. This bread was mocked by those who could afford better, but the long sourdough fermentation did something to the rye that modern quick-rise breads don't achieve. It broke down phytic acid and other anti-nutrients that bind minerals and make them unavailable for absorption. Sourdough fermentation also partially breaks down gluten and other proteins that can irritate the gut lining. The lactic acid produced during fermentation acts as a preservative, which is why sourdough rye kept for weeks without refrigeration, but it also creates an acidic environment in the bread that slows starch digestion. Research shows that structural differences in cereal products result in slower glucose uptake in the gastrointestinal tract following consumption of rye-based cereal products. This slower glucose uptake means less insulin is needed to maintain stable blood glucose concentrations. The rye factor phenomenon is related to slower uptake of glucose in the intestine. Medieval peasants eating sourdough rye had steadier energy and better blood sugar control than wealthy people eating fresh white wheat bread. The other benefit is the resistant starch that forms in sourdough rye. This starch resists digestion in the small intestine and feeds beneficial bacteria in the colon, similar to the effect of barley beta-glucan. This is the ideal bread for metabolic issues, but it was what poor medieval people ate because they couldn't afford anything better. Number 9. Chestnut bread, the southern poverty loaf that stabilizes blood sugar like no grain can. In medieval Italy and southern France, where chestnuts grew abundantly, the rural poor gathered them, dried them, ground them into flour, and baked them into bread. This was mountain poverty food, eaten by people who couldn't afford grain or lived in areas too poor to grow it reliably. But chestnut flour has a glycemic index dramatically lower than any grain flour, and it delivers minerals and phytonutrients that grain-based breads lack. Chestnuts are botanically nuts, not grains, which means their carbohydrate structure is fundamentally different. They contain more resistant starch and less rapidly digestible starch than wheat or rye. When you eat chestnut bread, the glucose release is slow and sustained. Research indicates that chestnut-based products produce significantly lower post-meal blood sugar responses compared to wheat bread, and subjects report feeling full for longer periods. Chestnuts are also rich in vitamin C, uncommon in staple foods, and contain significant amounts of potassium, magnesium, and manganese. Medieval peasants eating chestnut bread during winter were getting micronutrients that grain bread doesn't provide. The texture of chestnut bread is crumbly and slightly sweet, very different from grain bread. It doesn't have gluten, so it doesn't rise the way wheat bread does, resulting in a dense, cake-like texture. Medieval bakers often mixed chestnut flour with small amounts of grain flour to improve texture, creating a bread that combined the blood sugar benefits of chestnuts with the structure of grain. Today, chestnut flour is expensive and hard to find, sold as a specialty item for gluten-free baking. In medieval times, it was what poor people ate when they had no money for grain. We've inverted the value system completely. Number 10. Oat bread, the Scottish poverty staple that lowers cholesterol better than medication. Travel to medieval Scotland or the cold, wet north and west of England, and you'd find that wheat simply wouldn't grow. The soil and climate didn't favour it. Wheat bread was a luxury item for the wealthy, something most people never tasted. The poor ate oats, oat bread, oat porridge, oat cakes. Day after day, year after year. This was poverty food, the mark of a hard life in harsh conditions. The English looked down on the Scots for eating animal feed, but those Scottish peasants eating oats daily were consuming something that modern medical research now recognises as one of the most powerful cholesterol-lowering foods that exists. Oats contain a specific type of beta-glucan that's even more effective than the beta-glucan in barley. This soluble fibre forms a thick gel in your digestive tract that binds to cholesterol and bile acids, physically removing them from your body before they can be absorbed. Your liver then has to pull cholesterol from your bloodstream to make new bile acids, which lowers your blood cholesterol levels. Research shows that oat beta-glucan is the major active component in oats with various functional and nutritional properties, mainly cholesterol lowering and anti-diabetic effects. Regular consumption of oats has been shown to significantly reduce LDL cholesterol, the type associated with heart disease risk. Medieval Scottish farm labourers were well fed by English standards because their diet was based on oats along with abundant milk and some meat from household livestock as well as fish. Historical accounts describe these oat-eating peasants as big-boned, well-developed and mentally energetic. The oats they ate were whole grain, stone ground, with all the bran, germ and nutrients intact. Modern oat bread, when you can find it, is usually made from refined oat flour with most of the beta-glucan processed out. Medieval oat bread was coarse, dense and filling, the kind of bread that stuck with you through a day of physical labour in cold, wet conditions. Each of these breads was eaten by people who had no choice. They were markers of poverty and low social status. The wealthy ate refined white wheat bread and considered it superior in every way. But the nutritional reality is the opposite. The bread the poor were forced to eat kept them metabolically healthier than the bread the wealthy chose. We've inherited the preferences of medieval nobility without inheriting their active lifestyles or their lack of processed foods in the rest of their diet. We eat like rich people, refined grains and low fibre, but we live sedentary lives that can't handle that kind of nutrition. Medieval peasants ate like poor people, coarse whole grains and high fibre, but they worked physically and their bodies could use that slow-release energy efficiently. The question isn't whether medieval poverty bread was healthier. The nutritional data is overwhelming. The question is why we abandoned it. The answer is simple. Industrialization made white flour cheap and available to everyone. What was once a luxury became standard, and we built our entire food system around it. Whole grain bread, mixed grain bread, pulse bread, all became niche products or disappeared entirely. We optimized for softness, shelf life, and ease of production. We lost nutrition in the process. The solution isn't expensive supplements or specialty diets. It's returning to the bread that medieval peasants had no choice but to eat. Bread made from diverse grains, high in fibre, long fermented, and dense enough to sustain real work. If you're tired of modern bread that leaves you hungry and sluggish, if you're ready to eat like a medieval peasant instead of like modern marketing wants you to, hit that subscribe button. Every week we uncover forgotten food knowledge that actually improves health instead of just selling products. Drop a comment and tell me which of these 10 breads you'd be willing to try. I read every one because this community values function over fashion. This isn't just about bread. It's about recognizing that poverty sometimes forced better nutritional choices than wealth allows. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of refined flour and easy digestion. They ate bread that challenged their gut, stabilized their blood sugar, and kept them working.